710 KURV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, streaming live on KURV.com. My website is talkbackonline.com, where you can find archived old programs and other stuff. Anyway, we're here to educate educate our side as to how to present our arguments against the other side. We are individualists. We believe in people. The other side are statists, and they believe in government. And we can discard with the notions of Democrat, Republican, or any other party system, because if those in government, for the most part, believe in big government, and the rest of us, we believe in limited or no government. So therefore, the divisions are not along party lines, which is a misnomer. The divisions are between those who believe in individuals and those who believe in the state. Those of us who believe in individuals are optimists. We believe that all of our problems, or most of our problems, can be solved if the individuals are allowed to make their own decisions and run their own lives without interference from the government. Government people, on the other hand, are pessimists. They do not believe in the people. They have no faith. They think that people need to be dictated to, otherwise, they will run their lives off the rails. Yet, all the great catastrophes that have befallen mankind are man made, usually made by government, whether it is war, genocide, slavery, concentration camps, starvation, poverty. Almost all of it can be laid on the doorsteps of government. And it is the height of ironies that we are supposed to believe, or are led to believe by the media or the other useful dupes in academia, that all the problems that are created by war, by government, wars, genocide, slavery, poverty, hunger, and all the rest, concentration camps, are prevented by government, when in fact they are created by government. In fact, only government is capable of producing those products. The unemployment report came out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there's some interesting things. One is there was a massive jump not in the labor force. The number of individuals not going into the labor force in the one period increased by over 650,000 in 1 month. That is a massive, massive jump. It's unbelievable that that is not really being presented. There is a decline in the unemployment rate, but that unemployment rate keeps changing the denominator, which is why that is falling numerator, or even a non-falling numerator, will change the unemployment rate. For example, we have the interesting situation where there are less people employed now than either February, January, or that means there's 50 million people under the age of 65 not in the labor force, of a total civilian population of 244 million. If you take out the 40 million in a non-institutionalized population, adults we're talking about, that takes us down to about 200 million. So you have of 200 million potential people employed, you have 50 million that are not in the labor force. That is 1/4 of the population. So if you really want to find the true statistics on the unemployment rate, it is 25%. Highly European, exactly what Barack Obama wants. I think it's also important to understand that this is not considered a failure to Barack Obama and the Democrat Party. This is considered success. because those 50 million unemployed are on unemployment, food stamps, Medicaid. They have free public education and other handouts from the government, and therefore that 50 million people automatically is going to vote for big government, which means voting for Democrats. Now, if you don't believe that this administration is interested in having people becoming on the government plantation, all you have to do is look at the government programs of disability and Social Security programs. Within those two programs, which is one is called the SSI, which is a program to benefit the disabled, and a program called SSDI, which is another insurance program to benefit the disabled. The only difference is that the SSI funding comes from the general fund. The SSDI comes from the Social Security fund. Of course, in reality, that's just one fund, but that's how the government divides it up. Those in SSI, which are disabled under the age of 65, there are 6 million in that group. In the SSDI, the number that are under 65 in that group are 14 million. That means in the United States, receiving federal disability funds, there are at least 14 million Americans. What qualifies for disability? Nonsense, usually. The biggest component of disability is psychological. The next one is musculoskeletal, which means back pain. So more than half of those on disability is completely fraudulent. Interestingly, the number on disability has doubled under Barack Obama's regime. In fact, under Barack Obama is the first time that the Disability Trust Fund is actually running a deficit, and it is now a deficit of $31 billion. The Disability Trust Fund had always run a surplus until Barack Obama became president. It is now as a deficit of 31.2 million. We have 14 million Americans sucking up funds. There are who are falsely disabled. We have Social Security, in which 17 million of the 50 million people on Social Security are under the age of 65 total, of which 10 million of those are disabled. So that is why Social Security is going bankrupt. That is why the states are going bankrupt. That's why the country is going bankrupt. But the fact of the matter is, if you add all this together, what is Barack Obama trying to do? Barack Obama is setting up an environment which will perpetuate Democrat rule of handouts. The unemployment rate of 25% and 14 million adult Americans on disability is a huge population to begin with, which is completely government dependent. Once you add on federal workers and union members, then you have essentially half the population. And that is exactly the population that votes for Democrats every single election. So for the rest of us, we are in a bit of we have a problem. The problem that we have is that the enslaved group, psychologically and otherwise, that are beholden to big government and essentially the big government Democrats, is about half of the voting population. Now, only half of the potential voting population actually votes, which means of the 125 million people that do vote, 60 million of those are basically in the thrall of government, which makes it very, very difficult for any non-government individualist type of politician to win, because they would have to win 100% of the remaining votes. Now, due to the gross incompetence and negligence and stupidity of the Republican Party, they have made no inroads into the 125 million Americans who do not vote. Now, those in the media try to make it appear, and those in academia try to make it appear, that the ones who do not vote are not meeting their civil obligations. But that is complete nonsense. The fact of the matter is, the people who believe in government vote. The people who do not believe in government do not vote. It is not a lack of civic responsibility in which these people do not vote. It is because they have come to realize there is no purpose in voting because there is no distinction between the Republican and Democrat Party. The Republicans talk a good game, but when they do get into power, they do nothing about it. In fact, when Republicans get into power, they actually increase government expenditures, increase the deficit, increase the number of people on the government dole. Take a look at example of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That act was brought into being by George H.W. Bush, and an addendum was signed in 2008 by George W. Bush, 41. And the numbers of people that are now disabled is double what it was just 4 years ago. And you can blame George Bush on that, on the Disability Act. You can blame George Bush, Republican. So they're all in it together. And also George Bush expanded Medicare Part D, which has cost the taxpayers even more billions and billions of dollars. So the fact of the matter is what we have an aggressive fascist regime led by the Democrats with a passive fascist regime by the Republicans that orally or promotes verbally a limited government, but when it comes to practical effects, it does the opposite. And so the Republicans' refusal, because they're basically big government anyway, and most big government strategists are out there anyway talking about, Republican strategists are believing in big government anyway, trying to divide social concerns from economic as if you can really divide the two. Because when you, in your social concerns, when you say out of wedlock pregnancy and dependency on welfare is bad, but you say that we're not going to talk about social concerns, well, when you allow this rampant, uninhibited behavior to continue, that adds to the public dole millions and millions of individuals who cannot get work because they are uneducated and have children to take care of, but are perfectly satisfied in that position because they receive government handouts as their mothers did and as their fathers did and as their grandparents did. That is how sick it has become in this nation today. But it is important for us to understand that this is purposeful, because everyone receiving Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security or aid to dependent children, free public education, so-called free public education, food stamps, welfare payments, and every other government handout is in beholden to the government. Then you add on all the federal workers, all the state workers, and all the unions, because unions can only exist because of government force behind it. No union can exist without government protecting it, because unions are destructive to production. Unions are anti-production. The reason that the nation has lost its industrial base has nothing to do with competition from overseas and everything to do with making an impossible work environment in the United States through a combination of the uneducated created by government, unions driving up the costs of production. Unions are created by government. The regulations by government, which makes it impossible for a company to function, also by government. Product liability, which raises the costs of production enormously and the cost of doing business enormously. Lawyers, once again, can only function with the aiding and abetting of government. Taxes placed on business, which once again comes from government. So everything in government, everything that government does, makes it impossible for business enterprises, or very difficult for business enterprises to function in the United States. Even those companies which are supposedly American companies, such as Apple, all of their products are created in China. That is not because the Chinese are particularly efficient or inexpensive. It is because things are extremely inefficient and overly costly in the United States due directly to what government does with unions, education, taxes, regulations, product liability. That is our government today. That is the situation the United States finds itself in. This is the course of events. Now, you might have noticed that this time around, even though the surreptitiously created unemployment rate has fallen to 7.6%, and usually this is associated with ballyhoos from the media and from the academics, it has been muted this time. Now, the question is, why has it been muted? And the reason is that the government has an ulterior motivation here. For one reason or another, the government has been under what they call a sequester, in which there have been mandatory cuts in expenditures due to the inability to produce a budget under the rules that the government itself has created. And of course, the sequester means marginally smaller government, not practically, but at least theoretically marginally smaller. The problem for the politician and for the big government advocates in the media and in the academia is that if there is evidence that a decrease in government expenditures do not have a deleterious effect on the society, that would make people believe that possibly even smaller government might have even a beneficial effect, or at least not a deleterious effect on the government. That, of course, is not good for big government advocates. So because of the skewed way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates unemployment, then it appears the unemployment situation is improving, and therefore the economy is improving. This does not fit into the environment. This does not fit into the scenario that the government wants. So what you'll notice is, even though the unemployment rate has gone down, that the headlines are negative. They talk about the small amount of jobs increased, which was only 88,000. They talk about the 650,000 people that have gone off the chart because they're no longer considered in the unemployed group. They talk about the non-participation rate and all the people not in the labor force. It's very interesting that these are terms that are never normally addressed, and only the unemployment rate with the airheads such as Katie Couric and Tom Brokaw. But the government in this case has a problem because it cannot make it appear that even with a sequester and the obligated reduction across the board in government expenditures, it cannot be made to appear that that is in any way good. And so it has to discard the unemployment rate for now and then make a big deal about the non-participation rate, those leaving the labor force, and other considerations which it normally ignores. And you'll see it, they're saying that the low increase in employment, 88,000, is directly due to the sequester, which is a complete nonsense. There's no way that something which took effect 30 days ago in the government expenditures could have had any ripple effect, impact in the general society, general economy today in only 30 days. It's not possible. But you see how they're trying to link the sequester with everything negative that they could possibly muster up. Well, this is not unusual in the government. Another really good example of the way government functions is that like the global warming hoax, in which the weather temperatures can go up or down. It doesn't make a difference. Everything is attributed to man-created global warming. And that is what the government does. It just a complete detachment from facts and from science. That should not be surprising. There are no scientists in government. They're all attorneys and politicians that live in a fantasy made up world that cannot understand causality. There's very little logical thinking in the liberal arts wings of the university. That is, journalists, politicians, attorneys, most of those in academia belong to that branch of academia, of the university system, the liberal arts, where everything is opinion. Picasso is good, Picasso is bad. That is opinion. A movie is good, a movie is bad. That is opinion. The sodium atom is not opinion. It is what it is. Whether we understand it or not, it has a structure, and its structure is constant from year to year, age to age, country to country. Distinct from society and the laws of society, which change from year to year, age to age, society to society, country to country. That is why law is different in every country, and science is the same in every country, because science is real and law is arbitrary. The sodium atom is what it is. If we are going to use the sodium atom in a particular way, we have to understand its properties. We cannot impart properties which do not exist, because if we try to do that, our calculations will not work. The only way the calculations will work is if we understand the chemistry and the physics of the sodium atom and use it as it is meant to be used. On the other hand, you can have the exact same painting of a Van Gogh or a movie by a Steven Spielberg, and some people will like it and some people won't, but it's the same painting. It is the same movie. And is all based on opinion. And the success of Spielberg, or the relative success of Spielberg, or the success of Van Gogh depends completely on opinion and not on reality. It depends on arbitrary decision-making and not on decision-making based on evidence or facts. The government is chock full of those who believe in mythology, who do not understand causality, who have no logic, and in which their opinion is everything, perception is everything, and reality is essentially nothing, or has no part to play. In the court of law or in Congress, if the jury votes that the world is flat, and if Congress votes that the world is flat, then for all practical purposes, society will function as if the world were flat. And that is a society that is very, very limited. And that is why it is ignorance that caused the Middle Ages. And that is why it is education which gives us everything that we have today. No politician could have invented the airplane. No politician could have invented the light bulb. No politician can invent. And the reason is the politician lives in a box with defined borders. Those of imagination, the scientists and all, and those who create and who invent, they look beyond the box. But in order to look beyond the box, you have to believe that there is something beyond the box. Government does not believe anything beyond the box, and all they can do is rearrange the stuff within the box. And if you cannot imagine outside the box, if your mind is so constrained and chained by the bureaucracy, by the laws that exist, and where all you can do is manipulate the laws that exist, then you cannot create. Neither a lawyer nor a politician nor a journalist can create something, because they cannot imagine that which not exists. They are enslaved by all that they see and cannot imagine anything beyond it. That is why politicians are so bad at predicting what their programs will do, because they cannot extrapolate causality. They cannot put two and two together. They cannot connect the dots. And because they cannot connect the dots, to them all the dots are independent, floating about without connection independently, And when you increase welfare payments to the unwed mother, they do not understand that that increases the number of unwed mothers. When you reward people for being unemployed, they do not understand that that increases unemployment. When you reward people for not being educated, then government does not understand that that increases the number of the uneducated. And that is, of course, plays into the hands of the government anyway, because it is in their interest. It is in their interest to have the uneducated, because the uneducated and dependent are those that are dependent upon government. And the more dependency there is upon government, the stronger the government becomes, and the more powerful the government becomes, and the weaker that the people become. So that is the way government functions. That is the way government works. Doesn't matter what language the government speaks. And it really doesn't matter if the government calls itself fascist, communist, dictatorship, or a democratic republic. It really doesn't matter. The natural history, the natural inclinations, proclivities of all of those in government, in politicians and bureaucrats, are the same throughout the world, throughout history. That is why things do not change in government. The difference in the United States is that we have a constitution, and the constitution is created to constrain and restrict government and prevent government from imposing its will on the American people. Yeah. 7 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, streaming live on KURV.com. My website is online.com, talkbackonline.com, talkbackonline.com. We'll be back after this short break. Okay. We're back. 7 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. We're going to talk about now a topic which I have discussed many times, the pro-choice movement and the pro-life movement, topic of abortion, Roe v. Wade, etc. And interestingly, even though I have spoken about this topic many times, and it, of course, a topic that needs to be repeated, I have been able to find new little tidbits or things or ways of looking at it which I had not done before. It's one of the amazing things about what I've learned by doing this program is that there's always seems to be another wrinkle, another nuance, another way of looking at things. The conclusions are the same. I'm not saying that my conclusions have changed any, but remember, we're talking about debating the other side. My major purpose is not really to convert the other side to a great extent. That's almost impossible because I've been so brainwashed, but to give our side the ammunition to refute the arguments of the other side on all these issues rather than it becoming a shouting match as they have on Fox News, the worthless and phony conservative news station. And so I'm going to go through it again, and I'm going to highlight to the listener those things which I have come up with, which I have not referred to before. The thing is that those of us who live in the logical world, in the world of rational thinking, often get exasperated at the ignorance of the other side. For example, if I say the world is round and someone says the world is flat, we get so exasperated at their ignorance that we forget that we need to explain why the world is round so that the other side will understand it. We just can't yell at them because that's what they do to us, because the other side does that to us because they don't have any facts or evidence, and therefore they have to resort to yelling and screaming and jumping up and down, and you see that all the time. So we have to get down to basic arguments. So we have to respond to their arguments based on ignorance in a way that they can understand, because we want to be able to win the debate. So I'm going to go through the anti-abortion, uh, my discussion or lecture on anti-abortion. I'm going to go through that, and as I go through it, I'm going to bring up a few things which may not have said before on these exalted radio stations. The the first thing that we need, and I also I want to clarify that my position is not based on religion. There's nothing wrong with with the pro-life viewpoint based upon religion. The thing is then the other side, the pro-choice movement or the pro-abortion movement, then says that your viewpoint is based upon religion, and religion is an opinion and not provable, and therefore, as such, your opinion is worth no more than mine. And so it's fine for the theologians to do it and those who are devout, and I think that's good. But if we want to go after the other side, we've got to win the war, we have to invade their territory. You cannot win a war by staying on your side. The only way you can win a war is by destroying the other side. And to destroy the other side, you have to go after them on their turf. Otherwise, you cannot win. So let's begin our discussion. Natural laws are absolute, whether understood or not. Opinions, however, cannot be proven. Otherwise, they would not be opinion, but facts. They would be facts. Morality and ethics are opinions and change from age to age, society to society, country to country. Natural laws, on the other hand, are constant and universal. The element of sodium has a particular structure and properties regardless of opinion. It is what it is. It is unchanging for all time and is unchanging regardless of location. In order to use the sodium atom, it must be applied in specific manners consistent with its natural property. It cannot do what it was not meant to do, and what it cannot do, no matter how much one may try. Morals and ethics, however, are opinions as to what constitutes proper behavior in a society. Therefore, morality and ethics, unlike natural laws, vary. In Nazi Germany, for example, the belief system that they promoted of racial superiority dictated a morality and a code of ethics and a system of laws within that society in which discrimination based upon racial differences became not only mandatory and ingrained, but good for the population in their minds. In the Greco-Roman world, abortion and infanticide was considered routine and beneficial to society. In Roman law, the two acts were really not distinguished. The abortion and infanticide were considered the same act because the infant was not considered to have legal status until accepted by the head of the family. Therefore, the infant was a non-person who could be destroyed at will until gaining legal status. This explains why natural law is universal and morals are anything but. However, can we apply methods of scientific proof and logic to morality and ethics? The For example, I am here doing this radio program. I do not know where you are. I cannot prove for certainty where you are at this moment. However, what I can prove is you're not here. You're not here in this room. And so the point is, even though I may not be able to prove my assertion, I can still disprove your assertion. And if I'm able to disprove the arguments of the pro-choice movement, every single one of those arguments, even though I cannot prove that life is sacred, I cannot prove that the abortion of the in utero infant is wrong. I can't prove that the position on the other side that says the abortion of the in utero infant is proper and good, that I can disprove that argument. And if I can disprove the arguments of the pro-choice movement of the other side, then therefore I can prove that they are an invalid position. And so even though I may not be able to prove pro-life is the valid position, I can disprove that pro-choice. I can prove that pro-choice is invalid. The debate between the pro-choice and pro-life movements is portrayed as a battle between two valid ideologies, pro-life being religious and pro-choice being secular. Pro-life defends infant rights, pro-choice defends mother's rights. Pro-life is traditional, pro-choice progressive. Is that legitimate? It is not. Let's take a look at the arguments of the pro-choice movement. The false premises of the pro-choice movement. The undelivered infant is part of the mother, and therefore the mother has the right to choose what she can do with her own body. The truth is, the undelivered infant is not part of the mother's body and never was. The mother is born with all of her organs, and infant in the uterus is not one of them. The mother's blood supply and the infant's are completely separated. The mother has the same genetic structure in all of her organs, which is different from the genetic structure found in the infant. The infant has its own genetic structure, the mother has its different genetic structure, and these genetic structures remain through the entire life of the human being. The infant will respond independently to the stimulus. The intrinsic structure of the in utero infant is identical to the delivered infant and is unchanged throughout that individual's life. The genetic structure remains the same from conception throughout one's entire life. So this is something I've added on. So the pro-choice movement says the baby is part of the mother's body. But is the baby's heart part of the mother? So if the baby's heart stops functioning, does that mean the mother stops functioning? If the mother's heart stops functioning, can the baby's heart be used to keep the mother alive? The baby in the utero, can the baby's heart then continue the mother to live? Well, of course not. That's all nonsense. So if the baby's heart is not the mother's heart is not part of the baby, and the baby's heart is not part of the mother and cannot function as such, then if the heart itself is not part of the mother, and the mother's heart is not part of the baby, then none of the baby is part of the mother. The false premise that the mother has the right to kill the unborn infant, the undelivered infant, because the infant cannot survive without sustenance provided by the mother during pregnancy. The truth is that an infant cannot survive even after delivery without being provided sustenance by some provider. This dependency on sustenance does not give the person providing the sustenance the right of life and death over the person being provided sustenance. There are many elderly or disabled who cannot survive without sustenance being provided by a caregiver. This does not give that caregiver the right to kill the person being provided sustenance. The false premise that if one is not a woman, then one cannot judge the concerns of a woman and the issue of the abortion of the in utero infant. Well, first, most women are pro-life, and that is natural because the motherly instinct is stronger and more and stronger in a woman than the emotion that the male has for the child. Not to say the male doesn't have a strong attachment, but the mother's is stronger. The argument the pro-choice movement uses in this regard assumes a unique understanding particular only to women. Unique understanding to a group because is in human relations is absurd. We are all human. We all understand human emotion. We all understand justice. For a woman to say that a man cannot understand the issue of the abortion of the in utero infant because the man is not a woman and therefore cannot get pregnant and bear children is as logical as saying, I cannot judge the action of a pedophile for not being a pedophile. That one who is not a rapist cannot judge what drives a rapist. That if one is not a slaveholder, that one cannot judge a slaveholder and his view on slavery because we are not in that group and therefore do not understand all that's associated with those different activities. Using that absurd argument, using the woman's absurd argument, one could their argument falls on its face on that regard. But even if they were legitimate, in other words, I could not dictate to a woman something because I'm not a woman, because one is not a woman, the mother is also not the in utero infant. And the woman is going to dictate whether the in utero infant lives or dies. What right does the woman have to make that decision for the in utero infant? How can the woman understand since the woman is not the in utero infant, how is she capable of understanding the desires and needs and conditions of the in utero infant? So this is new. So this is particularly important because one, if the assertion of the pro-choice movement that if you're not a woman, you cannot judge the issue is as absurd as saying that if one is not a pedophile, that one cannot judge the actions of a pedophile. If we, on the other hand, go along with the assertion that we cannot judge a group because if we're not part of the group, then how is the mother allowed to decide what can happen to the in utero infant since she does not belong to that group? The next false premise is prior to a certain gestational age, the undelivered infant is not human. The truth is, then what is it if not human? The old terminology of birth being the point of delivery needs to conform to modern understanding. To be born is to be created. It used to be felt that you were born at the moment of delivery. But if one looks at the infant at delivery, it is obvious it was created before delivery. Modern science has shown that the creation of the human being is at the moment of conception, because at the moment of conception, the genetic code is put into place, and therefore all the ingredients necessary for the development of a complete human being are put into place at the moment of conception. So the old terminology of birth being at the point of delivery needs to conform to a modern understanding that the infant was created before delivery, born before delivery. The false premise of the immaturity of the infant denies complete human status. Just because the infant is not completely developed in the uterus, that is therefore not completely human. However, the maturation process continues after delivery. If one views an infant after delivery versus an infant of 6 months or a year or 2 years or a child or an adult, it is obvious there are changes even in the way of in the appearance and the ratio of head size to body size and all the rest. Sexual maturity, called puberty, does not begin until the early teenage years and does not end for a number of years after. Therefore, we are not sexually mature until our late teens or early 20s. And by the definition of that the pro-choice movement uses to provide for the killing of the in utero infant due to lack of maturity, under that logic, the lack of maturity of a 5 or 6-year-old allows them to be killed as well. There is the false premise that the undelivered infant can be sacrificed if a product of rape or incest. The truth is, the infant is conceived as a consequence of rape or incest is innocent. In the Kennedy versus Louisiana decision of 2008, the Supreme Court said that the punishment cannot exceed the crime. Therefore, the crime of rape, if not associated with the murder of the victim of rape, that the perpetrator of rape cannot be executed either. Yet in our society, we say that the completely innocent party or the completely innocent product of rape, which is the in utero infant, can be killed even though the perpetrator of rape cannot be killed. The pro-choice movement says that the pregnancy is a constant reminder of the violent act of rape. And so not becoming pregnant removes the memory of the rape, that somehow the memory of the rape is less powerful, or the negative kind of consequences, psychological consequences of rape is less consequential without an infant. Is that what you're saying? If you were not become pregnant, that rape becomes less of a horrid act to the individual? The pro-choice movement says that the hate of the infant that is a product of incest or rape is justification for the killing of the infant. But does hating someone allow the justification of killing someone? Does my hating someone legitimize the killing of the person that I hate? Well, of course not. There's the false premise that abortion is a woman's rights issue. Yet the truth is that more infant girls are killed than infant boys. In fact, in some countries where gender select abortion is permitted, the girls are killed specifically because they are girls. So how is it a women's rights issue? The false premise that abortion is a human rights issue. The truth is that the in utero infant is a human being. And what about the in utero infant's rights? The point is that those who believe in abortion of the in utero infant, if they're willing to kill the most innocent of human beings, then who are they not willing to kill? In the United States, those suffering the abortion of the in utero infant tend to be those who are poor, those who are in the minority of the population. So if abortion is a human rights issue, why is it that the ones who suffer the agonies of abortion, the infants that are killed, tend to be coming in an environment of poor people or minorities? Where is the human rights issue? Where's the justification of calling it a human rights issue if the ones who are suffering are the ones whose rights are being deprived through the abortion of the in utero infant? The pro-choice movement gives the false premise that children should not be brought into an environment of poverty. But the truth is, poverty is a relative condition. The wealthiest aristocrats of the Middle Ages lived under conditions far worse than Americans living in the lowest economic class today. and those in the Middle Ages died of infections that now we easily treat, even for among the poor. There was no automobiles or air conditioning or internet at that time. The likelihood of starvation was far greater then than it is today. So, so should we have advised that all pregnancies of the Middle Ages have been aborted? If one believes that poverty is a justification for the abortion of the in utero infant, then let us go talk with children living in poverty and ask if they would prefer to be alive or dead. The false premise of the pro-choice movement that views pregnancy as a disease. Disease cuts life short. The plague and widespread disease reduces human life. Pregnancy is essential to propagate human life. Without pregnancy, human life cannot exist. Disease limits life, while pregnancy is required for human life to persevere. The false premise that the undelivered infant can be sacrificed if the pregnancy endangers the mother's health or life. The truth is, there do not exist any health conditions whatsoever during pregnancy which require the intentional killing of the undelivered infant. An earlier than term delivery may be necessary, but the intentional killing of the infant is never required. An infant may be delivered early because of problems with the mother or problems with the infant, but the infant delivered can be perfectly viable. The infant may succumb to the environment if born excessively prematurely, but the intentional killing of the in utero infant is never, ever required under any circumstances. Now, we have shown that every single argument of the pro-choice movement is completely invalid. Yet the argument continues, and their position remains unabated by facts. And the reason is there's an underlying motivation beyond the debate as is presented in the media and academia today. In order to understand the true purpose of the Roe v. Wade decision and the abortion on demand issue and the government's promotion of abortion of the in utero infant, we have to go back to a previous decision to that of Roe v. Wade in 1962 to the Engel versus Vitale decision banning school prayer, and we will show you how that decision directly impacts on the future Roe v. Wade decision, because the Roe v. Wade decision had to be built on a foundation of other Supreme Court decisions which would lead us to the Roe v. Wade decision. The Engel versus Vitale decision banned school prayer based on a supposed constitutional requirement of a separation of church and state found in the First Amendment. Let's read the First Amendment. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The term separation of church and state does not exist in the First Amendment. Where did the phrase, the separation of church and state, originate? It originated in an exchange of letters in 1801 between the Danbury Baptists of Connecticut and the new President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. The Danbury Baptists wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying, "And such has been our laws and usages, and such still are, so that religion is considered as the first object of legislation, and therefore what religious privileges we enjoy as favors granted, and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men." The concerns of the Baptists were that in Europe, from which they had fled, that each country had its own state religion, and those that did not adhere to the state religion were biased against, prejudiced against, and oftentimes harmed for not physically harmed for not adhering to the state religion. And so the Danbury Baptists, who had come to the colonies in order to escape religious persecution, were concerned that the new United States government might itself promote a state-sponsored religion which would be contrary to the beliefs of the Baptists. Thomas Jefferson, in response, in order to allay their fears, said in his response letter, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature would make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." 7 and KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman will be back after this short commercial break. Okay, we're back. 7 and KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, streaming live on KURV.com. My website is talkbackonline.com. Now, to understand why it is important for the government to eliminate religion from the public sphere, we look at the organization that is most noteworthy for the assault on the expression of religious liberties, and that is the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union routinely goes out trying to deny expression of religious views in schools or any other public place, up even trying to get the Ten Commandments removed from courthouses. The American Civil Liberties Union promotes itself as a defender of First Amendment rights. However, if one looks at the First Amendment, the first right is the law respecting the freedom of speech. That the Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So, freedom of speech is not even the first right being protected. The first right, and the very first right listed in the First Amendment, is the right of religious expression. So then why does the ACLU spend so much time attacking the right of religious expression, hiding under the shield of the right of free speech? Why not look at other things rather than attacking religion? Well, if one goes and looks at the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, they are Roger Nash Baldwin and William Z. Foster, both of whom were members of the Communist Party during the reign of Stalin. The ACLU was founded by communists, dominated by communists, funded by communists of the Soviet Union. William Z. Foster, at the time, was the chairman of the Communist Party of America. Now, what communist country allows free speech? Well, none do. And so, therefore, why would a communist-funded organization promote itself as a defender of free speech? But in fact, the ACLU is not a defender of free speech. The ACLU is a attacker of religious expression. And why is that? It is because government wants to be the ultimate authority. Religion provides an avenue of authority for the average citizen. So the government is in competition with religion for the hearts, minds, and souls of the individual. Now, religion is based on morals. Government is amoral. Government has no morality whatsoever. That is why government can commit war and genocide, concentration camps, and slavery. Why the government can make a German an enemy one day and a German a friend the next day. Why the government can arrest American citizens because they look like the citizens of another nation. The United States and all governments are amoral, and they have to be amoral so that the government can do what it wants to do when it wants to do it to fulfill its own agenda. So the American Civil Liberties Union's philosophy is based upon elimination of religious expression, because the ACLU is a Bolshevik organization that, of course, which believes in big government. And big government is based on an amorality, and therefore religion, which has morality, has to be eliminated because it confuses the population as to what is right and wrong. The ACLU has a philosophy built upon amorality. It defends homosexual behavior and same-sex marriage. It defends the distribution of manuals depicting pedophilia. It defends the dissemination of videos which depict child pornography. It defends the late-term abortion, which is nothing more than murder. It defends the right of minors to get abortions without parental consent. It defends the dispensing of birth control devices in public schools. It is all for gun control. The ACLU promotes an amoral society. The ACLU promotes big government, and those go hand in hand. And so the American Civil Liberties Union exists to empower big government. Government views religion as a competitive force in society in order to control the emotions or the thinking of the citizens. Therefore, government views religion as a competitor. Religion has a fixed morality, which defines good and evil, right and wrong. Government has no morality, and therefore a system which exists, which defines the difference between right and wrong, is inconvenient for a system founded on the philosophy of government being all-powerful, of government being all-knowing, government being universal. Government wants to be God. The ACLU was founded and maintained by Bolsheviks as a means to disseminate this philosophy. The next Supreme Court decision, which helped create the foundation of the Roe v. Wade decision, is the Griswold versus Connecticut decision of 1967. This is where the non-existent right to privacy was discovered by the Supreme Court. In a case over the prescription of birth control pills, the court conferred a right to privacy. Justice William O. Douglas, writing the decision, said, "A modern interpretation of the Bill of Rights imparts an extension of those rights from penumbras formed by emanations of those guarantees, which give them life and substance." However, there is no right to privacy found in the Constitution. The William O. Douglas said that shadows created by emanations of rights created new rights that were not explicitly delineated in the Constitution. This, of course, is nonsense. The right to privacy, or the lack of the right to privacy, was not an oversight in the Bill of Rights. It was intentional. The Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights says, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the places to be searched and the people or things to be seized." There is no right to privacy in the Constitution. A right to privacy cannot exist, for that would allow a criminal act performed in the privacy of one's home to be insulated from the law. The Griswold versus Connecticut decision was one of the pillars of the Roe v. Wade decision because the right to privacy would now allow the mother the right, non-existent right, to murder her undelivered infant and have the act insulated from the law. With these two decisions, the foundation had now been laid permitting the construction of the Roe v. Wade decision, a decision which could not have been legislated, so those with an agenda used a flanking movement bypassing those subject to the electoral process and using the judiciary to legislate under the ruse of pre-existing laws already contained within the Constitution, which of course did not exist. The false premises of the Roe v. Wade decision. The Roe v. Wade decision begins with the statement, the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing views, and the accident of our finding certain opinions natural and familiar or novel and even shocking ought not to conclude our judgment upon the question whether the statutes embodying them conflict with the Constitution of the United States. This is, of course, nonsensical. The Supreme Court is saying that the Constitution will hold valid for those of fundamentally differing views. This is, of course, false. The Constitution is written for a single point of view of individual rights. And the Constitution is not to be interpreted in any other way. You cannot mold the Constitution into something arbitrary to conform to a popular opinion. Otherwise, there's no point in writing a Constitution. There's no point in having a written document if you can impart motivations into it of whatever. We are to conform to the Constitution. The Constitution does not conform to us. But because of this false interpretation of the Constitution, the Roe v. Wade decision is allowed to use all kinds of erroneous and false ideas to promote its conclusions, which were preconceived, by the way. The Roe v. Wade decision incorporates ancient beliefs which are no longer accepted, but nevertheless are still used in the Roe v. Wade decision. For example, they refer to the Aristotelian theory of mediate animation. This is the theory that the soul is incorporated at some unknown time after conception. This belief, of course, has been discarded. We have in the Roe v. Wade decision the statement that the view of life beginning at conception have substantial problems. For a precise definition of this view are posed, however, by new embryological data that purport to indicate that conception is a process over time rather than an event. This, of course, is completely nonsensical. We know that conception is definitely an event, and is not a process. Things leading to conception may be a process, but the act of conception itself is not. It is a singular event. Although these are obviously absurd statements, they are arguments used today by those in a pro-choice movement to justify abortion on demand. The Roe v. Wade decision uses outmoded science. For example, they refer to the term quickening. Quickening is the now discarded notion that human life does not become present until the movement of the in utero infant is noted on the mother's abdomen. Using this antiquated terminology, the court said, it is undisputed that at common law, abortion performed before quickening was not an indictable offense. The significance of quickening was echoed by later common law scholars and found its way into the received common law in this country. The absence of a common law crime for pre-quickening abortion appears to have developed from a confluence of earlier philosophical, theological, and civil and canon law concepts of when life begins. This is absurd. This is a term which no one uses. Now, in modern science, we know that life in the uterus of the in utero infant begins long before 16 to 18 weeks when quickening is first noted. Beliefs which are, regardless of how long they have been held, are discarded when found to be false. Those societies based upon slavery are no longer considered valid, regardless of how accepted and common they once were. The Supreme Court uses as a false premise the term non-viability, stating, with respect to the state's important and legitimate interest in potential life, the compelling point is at viability. This is so because the fetus then presumably has the capability of meaningful life outside the mother's womb. What is this definition of meaningful? Are they saying that somehow the in utero infant's life is not meaningful prior to a certain gestational age? The supposed non-viability of the infant is only because of its forced extraction from its normal environment. The in utero infant becomes non-viable if taken out of the womb prematurely, the same way we are non-viable if placed underwater and held there. That does not mean we're non-viable. If you take the infant out of its environment, normal environment, into an adverse environment, you cannot declare that saying the infant is not viable. Putting me without clothes in the North Pole, I will succumb to the elements. That doesn't mean I'm not a viable human being. It is an artificial act, remember, which takes the in utero infant out of the uterus and places it into a, at that time, hostile environment. And by that definition, the child becomes non-viable, and by that excuse, the in utero infant is considered liable for extinction. On such nonsense is this court decision made. The court misappropriates the arbitrary designation of trimesters, which is irrelevant to the definition of human life, but becomes the means of designating the infant falsely as somehow intrinsically different during different stages of the maturation process. The court says, for the stage prior to approximately the end of the first trimester, the abortion decision and its effectuation must be left to the medical judgment of the pregnant woman's attending physician. And one might ask, is what is so particular about the morality of a physician? Let's take a look at the well-respected Nazi and Soviet physicians and their behavior during the Soviet and Nazi regimes. What about the abortionist physicians in the United States and that behavior? How is that considered legitimate? How about those physicians in the United States that did late-term abortions, or those physicians of the United States that have been convicted of murder by killing the infant after delivery? There is nothing particular about the average physician which gives that physician a higher moral status. Does not give that physician the right to, and the mother the right to discard the due process owed to the in utero infant. The state considers the infant a non-entity in the first trimesters, referring only to mother's health, as if the in utero infant did not exist at all. It is not even mentioned. The in utero infant is not even mentioned in the Supreme Court decision in reference to the first two trimesters. However, by the third trimester, the obviously human infant cannot be so easily ignored and therefore must be taken into account. Thus, the rationale changes to justifiable homicide. And the court says, for the stage subsequent to viability, the state, in promoting its interest in the potentiality of human life, may, if it chooses, regulate and even proscribe abortion, except where necessary in appropriate medical judgment for the preservation of life or health of the mother. Once again, eliminating the life or health of the baby. We have already discussed that there are no instances in the pregnancy which requires the intentional killing of the in utero infant. But the court goes one step further in describing what falls under the title of justifiable homicide. A justifiable homicide can be performed in the killing of the in utero infant, even if the life of the mother or the physical health of the mother is not endangered. The court says maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by child care. There is also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child. And there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable psychologically and otherwise to care for it. In other cases, as in this one, the additional difficulties and continuing stigma of unwed motherhood may be involved. All these are factors the woman and her responsible physician necessarily will consider in consultation. So now, under the heading of life and health of the mother, comes convenience. The mother's convenience is now considered a justification for homicide. Whereas the court creates non-existent rights, those rights which do exist are discarded. The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life without the due process of law. How does the Roe v. Wade decision get around that? Well, it does so by saying that the in utero infant is not a person. The court says all this together persuades us that the word person, as used in the 14th Amendment, does not include the unborn. In short, the unborn have never been recognized in the law as persons in the whole sense. Such an unethical interpretation of the Constitution is nothing new for the Supreme Court. A similar conclusion is found in another Supreme Court decision. The question before us is whether the class of persons described are constituent members of this sovereignty. We think they are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. This is the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which justified slavery. Other corruptions of language occur in the Roe v. Wade decision. The word abortion does not mean the killing of the in utero infant. The word abortion means the premature termination of any process. The abortion of pregnancy is the premature termination of pregnancy. The abortion of life is the premature termination of life. You can have a premature termination of a trip, of a vacation. The abortion is simply the premature termination of any process. Abortion and the killing of the in utero infant are not synonyms. The abortion of pregnancy for reasons of a mother's health can be accomplished without the intentional killing of a live infant. But the linchpin of the pro-choice movement's agenda on the abortion issue must require the killing of the in utero infant as part of the abortion of pregnancy. Therefore, the Supreme Court creates a definition of abortion which exists only in the Roe v. Wade decision and is completely fabricated. The Supreme Court's definition of abortion is the termination of human pregnancy with an intention other than to produce a live birth. So the Supreme Court gives away its hand. It says that the purpose of abortion is to kill the in utero infant, not to terminate the pregnancy. That the only reason they want to terminate the pregnancy is specifically through the act of killing of the in utero infant. So the distinction lies in the intent. An abortion of pregnancy for reasons of mother's health may lead to the death of the infant as a consequence of extreme prematurity, which is distinct from those abortions of pregnancy whose intent is the abortion of the infant's life. The sinister true purpose of the legalization of the abortion of pregnancy granted in the Roe v. Wade decision is the intentional abortion of an infant's life for the convenience of the mother or her partner. Now, to understand even more deeply what is going on here, because we have not yet reached the true underlying motivations of the pro-choice movement and those promoting the pro-choice movement. The underlying motivation is eugenics and elitism. We have to go back to Robert Thomas Malthus, born in 1766, an accountant who wrote an essay on the principle of population. His philosophy was that the world is limited through resources, and thus for civilization to progress and advance, those limited resources must be reserved for the better elements of society. That the society must protect those more intellectually capable, and those who are poor and who are intellectually incapable must be reduced or eliminated. And so Robert Thomas Malthus railed against charity, railed against helping the poor, railed against helping what he considered the unfit, and advised placing them all into crowded, unsanitary conditions to reduce their life expectancy and reduce their ability to procreate. This philosophy was then picked up by Charles Darwin. He wrote in his, Charles Darwin, the founding theorist of evolution, in his studies of natural life, is considered a great scientist, and I suppose that he was. But the true underlying motivation of Charles Darwin is rarely divulged, but we have it here. Charles Darwin wrote in his Descent of Man, Where Man Comes From, the various checks specified, checks on procreation is what he's referring to, do not prevent the reckless, the vicious, and otherwise inferior members of society from increasing at a quicker rate than the better class of men. The nation will retrograde, as has occurred too often in the history of the world. We must remember that progress is no invariable rule. It is most difficult to say why one civilized nation rises, becomes more powerful, and spreads more widely than another, or why the same nation progresses more at one time than another. We can only say that it depends on an increase in the actual number of the population, on the number of the men endowed with high intellectual and moral faculties, as well as on their standard of excellence. Corporal structure, except so far as vigor of body leads to vigor of mind, appears to have little influence. What Darwin is saying is that we must promote the procreation of the more intellectually capable, that unfortunately the ability to procreate does not run parallel to physical strength, which seems to be more available in the non-intellectually capable. 7th KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Be back after this short break. 7th KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. We're back. And so we're talking about Malthus, we're talking about Charles Darwin. So Darwin, we have to understand what his real motivations are. Darwin is saying that natural selection in the animal kingdom is dependent upon physical ability, adaptability to the environment. The animal or plant that survives is the one that's better able to adapt to the environment. What Darwin is saying then is man's progress, unlike animals' progress, which is due to physical prowess, for man is intellectual prowess. Since man's intellectual prowess does not run parallel to his physical prowess, therefore, what man has done is by creating a society which promotes those of less intellectual capability of surviving, whereas in the animal kingdom, those of less physical prowess would not survive. If we extrapolated that to the human element, then if intellectual capacity was what was most important for survival, or at least progress, but that intellectual capacity is being diluted by allowing those of less intellectual capacity to survive. Therefore, it was necessary to create a situation in human civilization which would reduce the ability of the less fit, defined by Darwin, whatever that less fit was, to not survive, and promote those of greater intellectual capacity. This philosophy was picked up by his cousin, Francis Galton. Francis Galton is the one who created the term eugenics, which means good genes. Galton's philosophy, picking up on Darwin's, was that the strength of human beings was based upon, on individual groups, was based upon their genetic code. That the genetic code determined the intellectual capacity of the average human being. Therefore, according to Galton, it was necessary and possible that we could arbitrarily and artificially select out those carrying good genes from those carrying bad genes. How do you define the difference between good genes and bad genes? Well, they did it based upon society, in the way society, what is considered by those leaders in society as to what is good and what is bad, as far as genetic structure. And in looking at society, Galton and others presumed that those who are economically successful obviously must be must have good genetic structure, and those who are poor must have poor genetic structure. Coincidentally, those who were poor tended to be those of Jewish, Hispanic, or Black origin. And so the conclusion was drawn that those of Jewish, Hispanic, Black origin, and of course all others who were poor, were of an inferior genetic stock, and therefore that genetic stock needed to be reduced, and that the genetic stock of the superior races needed to be concentrated and promoted. This philosophy was then picked up by Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a eugenist. She believed in birth control. In the 1920s, she created an organization called the American Birth Control League, dedicated to birth control, primarily birth control of those who were blacks, Hispanic, Jews, and the poor. Margaret Sanger believed in the superiority of one race over another. This is long before the onset of Nazism and their belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. The pro-abortion movement sprang forth from those who harbored the philosophy of eugenics. The concept that heredity and not environment is the major determinant of human behavior. Since genetic makeup governs human characteristics, the quality of genes passed on to future generations will determine the quality of the resultant civilization. Therefore, those populations transmitting good genes needed to be promoted, while those populations transmitting bad genes needed to be reduced. Margaret Sanger said, "Give dysgenic groups, which are the people with bad genes, in our population their choice of segregation or sterilization." This Margaret Sanger wrote in her Birth Control Review magazine, April 1932. This philosophy was then picked up by the Germans, and Margaret Sanger and the eugenics movement were the mentors of Adolf Hitler and those in the Nazi movement. Many of you may be surprised at that. There are those who believe that Margaret Sanger was a proponent of liberation and that her seemingly outrageous statements are quite justified but taken out of context. But the following we're going to give is an exact excerpt of Margaret Sanger without any editing or omissions. The Eugenic Value of Birth Control Propaganda by Margaret Sanger. Seemingly every new approach to the great problem of the human race must manifest its vitality by running the gauntlet of prejudice, ridicule, and misinterpretation. Eugenists may remember that many years ago, this program for race regeneration was subjected to the cruel ridicule of stupidity and ignorance. Today, eugenics is suggested by the most diverse minds as the most adequate and thorough avenue to the solution of racial, political, and social problems. The most intransigent and daring teachers and scientists have lent their support to this great biological interpretation of the human race. As an advocate of birth control, I wish to take advantage of the present opportunity to point out that the unbalance between birth rate of the unfit and the fit, admittedly the greatest present menace to civilization, can never be rectified by the inauguration of a cradle competition between these two classes. In this matter, the example of the inferior classes, the fertility of the feeble-minded, the mentally defective, the poverty-stricken classes should not be held up for emulation to the mentally and physically fit, though less fertile parents of the educated and well-to-do classes. On the contrary, the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. The doctrine of birth control is now passing through the stage of ridicule, prejudice, and misunderstanding. A few years ago, this new weapon of civilization and freedom was condemned as immoral, destructive, obscene. Gradually, the criticisms are lessening. Understanding is taking the place of misunderstanding. The eugenic and civilizational value of birth control is becoming apparent to the enlightened and the intelligent. So what Margaret Sanger is saying is that something needs to be done to reduce the procreation of the inferior classes, and those inferior classes are based upon racial, political, and social problems, attributes. Margaret Sanger continues, people are always saying that our National Socialist racial thinking is materialistic, unchristian, chauvinistic, imperialistic, and that it leads to the defamation of foreign races and peoples. The opposite is the case. We believe that our racial policy is the surest guarantee for mutual respect and for peaceful coexistence between the peoples of this world. Someone of another race is different from me both in body and soul, for both are important. To those who claim that we act in an unchristian way, sinning against the will of God, we reply that we are convinced that we are acting consistent with the will of the Creator when we prevent unhealthy life from being propagated, saving children and their children from new and enormous misery. The Creator himself established the laws of life, which harshly and brutally let all that is unworthy of life perish, to make room for the strong and healthy to whom the future belongs. This is necessary for the preservation and development of all that lives on this earth. Even more absurd is the objection that our law on the sterilization of the genetically ill permits their sterilization without their explicit consent. We think it would be ridiculous to allow the genetically ill who may lack intelligence, as with the feeble-minded, or free will, as in the case of the mentally ill, to make this decision, particularly since we already control their use of money and other dead things. It would be absurd to leave them with far more important decisions on procreation and children. I believe that we have a good conscience before the world when we eliminate life that is unworthy of life, particularly when we see everything that the poisonous seed of communism is senselessly slaughtering thousands of valuable people. The most important measure since the last party rally is a law for the protection of genetic health of the German people. Aha, I gave it away. The bottom line is this. What I just said in the last couple of minutes was not from Margaret Sanger. It was from Gerhard Wagner, chief physician Nazi, promoting the Aryan policy of the Nuremberg laws, in which German citizens of Jewish extraction were no longer considered citizens of the state. You can see taken directly from Margaret Sanger. And if you don't think that means anything, in 1927 in the Buck versus Bell decision, extrapolating what Margaret Sanger was saying, and before even with before 8 years before Gerhard Wagner's speech in Nuremberg, discussing the elimination of the unfit as a question of health and a question of the necessity to preserve society. You have the Buck versus Bell decision in 1927, Supreme Court decision 1927, written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, in which he says, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence, it is better for the entire world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Therefore, forced sterilization of the unfit as defined by government is considered constitutional, considered legitimate and legal, just as slavery was considered legitimate and legal in the 1857 Dred Scott decision, such as it is considered legal and acceptable and legitimate to kill the undelivered infant in the Roe v. Wade decision. Such do we have Supreme Court decisions. Such do we have the mind of the elitists, for that is what they are. Margaret Sanger was constrained to change the title of her organization from the American Birth Control League in 1943 to what we refer to it today. In 1943, the Nazis were definitely not considered part of proper society in the United States, since we were at war with the Nazi Party. And though we concealed the fact that we were a eugenist nation as much as the Germans were, now that we were at war with them, Margaret Sanger had to change the title of her organization, which she did, changing it from the American Birth Control League to what we call it today, Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, which last year had a festival, a gala, in which they celebrated their murder of 350,000 human infants in the year 2012, for which they received hundreds of millions of dollars in government money, your taxpayer dollars, paying for the murder of the most innocent of lives. That is the nation we have become today. So if we look at this, we have come full circle. We find that the pro-abortion American Civil Liberties Union, founded by communists, and the creators, and founded by communists, and that Planned Parenthood, the organization founded by fascists, both promote abortion. Why? Because both organizations promote big government. Big government is based on the philosophy that there is an elite in the world that is innate and born, and that they have the right, duty, and obligation to control the lives of others, that they have the power of life and death over others that they consider of less quality. Big government is the home of the elitists. People go into government to control the lives of others because they think they're smarter and better than others, and they are not. But that belief has led to war, genocide, concentration camps, and mass murder. The denying of the right to life is the denial of all rights, for without the right to life, no other right can exist. The right to life is natural. It is not a privilege bestowed by government upon human beings. Legitimate government guarantees rights. And when a government denies a right, the right is not eliminated. The legitimacy of government is eliminated. It is therefore up to each one of us to become educated and to educate others as to what exactly is going on. When we discover the true basis of the pro-choice, pro-abortion, birth control movement, it is the desire of the elite to implement their sordid philosophy where human life is defined, where some life is considered less valuable than others, and that human life is defined by the class in which one lives. that there are some born to rule and others born to be enslaved. That is what our government believes. That is what the elites believe. That is what we are fighting against. Now we have shown through this discussion, which you will not hear anywhere else, we have shown through this discussion what the real motivations are of those promoting pro-choice philosophy. It is not a rights issue. It is not a women's rights issue. It is not the question of religion. It is a question of who's going to control your life. Are you going to control your life, or is government going to control your life? It is the belief of a certain segment of society that they are smarter, innately smarter, better than than other segments, and that other segments must be reduced in order to accentuate the segment to which they coincidentally belong. So the situation is where it is. The entire pro-choice movement is based upon lies. It is based upon junk science. It is based upon junk law. It has no basis in it is based upon perception exclusively. The canard that economic policy can be distinguished from social policy is nonsensical, because an amoral society or an immoral society will fail economically. It has to, because success in economics is based upon free market, capitalism, individualism, freedom, liberty, independence. A successful economy depends upon those factors which allow each human being to manifest his or her talent without encumbrance of an overseer. Social morality in this country is being dictated by the government, which says that all things are acceptable, that everything goes, that if a human being can do it, then it should be allowed, no matter how immoral, no matter how evil. Human beings must aspire to greatness, go beyond where we are today. Everything that is great that we have today came from unknown sources. Thomas Edison was not born rich. Alexander Graham Bell was not born rich. Michael Dell was not born rich. Bill Gates was not born rich. Steve Jobs was not born rich. They have made us all richer and themselves wealthy, deservedly so. The Wright brothers were not politicians. Alexander Graham Bell was not a politician. Salk and Sabin and Salk were not politicians. All the greatness that we have, the producers of all that we have, of antibiotics, of technology, of all the greatnesses that our society now has, none of it came through the actions of politicians or governments. Quite the contrary. All of our greatness and benefits are reduced by government enslaving the mind of human beings, enslaving the bodies of human beings. That is what our government wishes to do. That is what all governments wish to do. And that is why our founding fathers created a constitution, to prevent government from doing its natural behavior, from preventing politicians to do what they naturally want to do. Government exists as a mechanism to control the lives of others. Politicians go into politics wish to control the lives of others. The mechanism of government fits hand in glove with the psychological proclivities of the narcissistic individuals that go into politics. The Constitution was created to limit the effect of government. It created a system of checks and balances to limit what government could do. Government had to be limited in order to allow individuals to be free. An unlimited, unrestrained, unconstrained government enslaves. The Constitution was meant to keep the people free. Government was meant to guarantee individual rights, not dictate individual rights and treat them as privileges. But we have lost our way. And our government and our politicians for a long time now have undermined and destroyed the Constitution, not to help advance society, not to progress society, but to empower government and enslave the people. And we are enslaved. We live in a fascist dictatorship. We do what we are allowed to do. We think we are free because we are allowed to wander around within the confines of the plantation. And we think by our being able to do that we are free. We are not free. We are enslaved. We are taxed and we are regulated and we are told what to do. And as long as we pay our taxes and accept the regulations and do as we are told, we think we are free, but we are not free. We are as enslaved as the Cubans in Castro, Cuba, as the Soviets in Soviet Russia. Their constraints may have been a little more stringent than ours, but as long as you remained within the confines of what the government allowed, you were left unharmed. If you crossed the line, you were eliminated. And if you don't think it's the same here, if I do not wish to pay my taxes, I am eliminated. If I do not wish to follow government regulations, I am eliminated. All of you who wish to take marijuana or cocaine, the government will eliminate you as well. And so those of you who cross the government arbitrarily constructed line will be eliminated, so that you voluntarily consent to remain within the confines of a government boundary and you think you are free. You are not free, because you're only free to do what the government allows you to do. We are not free individuals in this nation, and we were meant to be free under the Constitution. But we are highly regulated and highly controlled, and more so every single day. But what I have found to be true is unfortunate. That as the Israelites said to Moses, as they were in the desert, freed from bondage, but now pursued by the Egyptians, they said they prefer to be enslaved and safe in the confines of the boundaries of Egypt, rather than to be free and face the travails and risks and problems associated and the responsibilities of those who are free. So therefore, they found that they found it much more, found themselves to be happier to be slaves. Well, that is what I have found to be true, that in this country, there's a significant proportion of the population, maybe even a majority, that prefers to be enslaved, that feels more comfortable being enslaved, that prefers to be on government dole, that prefers to live on government handout than to be free and to have liberty and be responsible for your own lives. Too many now prefer others to be responsible for their lives and want me and you to be responsible for their parents, for their children, for their lives, for their food, rather than they're having to be responsible for their own. And a gun is placed to our head by the government, a figurative gun, which can become a literal gun if you choose, that says that we are forced to do what the government tells us to do against our will, shrouding it under the shield or umbrella of good deeds. That is not a good deed. It is simply the empowerment of a fascist dictatorship, which is the nation in which we live today. 7 on KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, back next week with more insights that you'll not hear anywhere else.